So welcome everyone. My name is Jasmine Barrett. I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. I'm researching disability in North Korea, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the University of Melbourne stands, the Wurundjeri people and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations. And I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd now like to hand the floor to my supervisor, Dr. Jae Song, who is Associate Professor of Korean Studies at the University of Melbourne, and she's going to offer some welcoming remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jasmine, and welcome everyone. Good to see you in this lovely evening just before the Easter break. So thanks for joining us for tonight's Korean Studies seminar. I too acknowledge the traditional owner and custodian of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to their elders past and present and emerging. Today's topic is of many people's interest and certainly mine, and it's also something different from nuclear weapons or missiles, although another nuclear test is imminent, many newspaper report pointed to. It's also something close to ordinary people who are living in North Korea. The development assistance or the lack of it is having a big impact on the people who are living in North Korea, and especially going through COVID-19, the global pandemic has further isolated the country. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's, this evening, and Sojin's early morning in the UK. Really looking forward to the topic and hope you all enjoy today's topic. Thank you so much. So without further ado, I'll hand it back to Jasmine for introduction of the speaker today.
Thanks very much. Yes, very pleased to welcome Dr. Sojin Lim, who is an Associate Professor at the University of Central Lancaster. She is the course leader for both the MA in North Korean Studies and MA in Asia Pacific Studies. And she is the co-director of the International Institute of Korean Studies at the University of Central Lancashire. Prior to becoming an academic, Sojin worked in the international development industry for the Korean government. So without further ado, I will hand the screen to you, Sojin. Thank you very much. And we're very much looking forward to your presentation on international development assistance in North Korea.
Right. It's great to see everybody here. Yes, as it was introduced, it's really early in the morning, but at least the weather is sunny today, so I'm happy. And it's really good to see you, Jay and Jasmine here. And thank you very much for inviting me for your talk at Melbourne. It would have been even nicer if we could have seen each other face to face, but it's really far. So always online is also good. As Jay introduced, I am gonna talk about the North Korea from somewhat different perspectives today. Some academics in the field tend to tell me I'm kind of naive or less security focused person. Some critics tell me that without considering security and nuclear program and talking about people only can be very dangerous and risk. I get it, I understand that, but at the same time, still some needs to think about people in North Korea, because the defectors outside of North Korea, they talk about human rights of North Koreans, but it can't reach in North Korea. So currently I'm writing a monograph about how we can change our narratives from security focused to people focused. So today, this is a little bit of just nutshell, and I really want you to all have interest in or have a somewhat different perspectives when we talk about North Korea. These are the basic frame of my talk today. I'm not going to spend much time on this. Now I believe that you all see my screen, because from my laptop it came back, thankfully. So this is the one which I now want you to think about whenever you see this kind of news clips from about North Korea. Whenever you see aid, and normally we tend to think, oh, aid, the support to North Korea, but I want you to think in some more context from now on. So I will show this slide at the end of my talk again, and to see whether now you have a better understanding about the aid to North Korea or not. So let's start from here. What is aid? I will briefly talk about the aid. In the academic papers or the news coverage, media coverage, or in the daily conversation, we talk about aid, development aid, humanitarian aid, the support. These terms are all different. They deliver all different meanings. So technically they are all different aid, but we tend to mix these up. That's why sometimes whenever I see the news clips, I get really interested in what kind of aid they mean here. Especially when you see military aid, this is typically how United States deliver, like, aid to Afghanistan. It includes military aid. So some of the aid component of US, when we just say aid, it's not normally development aid only, so it has a military aid component. And when we talk about humanitarian aid, it's more about based on the urgent or ad hoc based. So when you talk about the aid to North Korea in 1990s, mostly it was humanitarian aid, not development aid. And here, development aid means focus more about institutional development, capacity development of the country or state function. But when we talk about humanitarian aid, it's more about food aid, what we know. Or, whenever we have a tsunami in the Indonesia, for example, then the emergency aid is provided with water or the sanitary things. They are what we call the humanitarian aid. So these are different aid. And nowadays we have a new term called TOAST at the very bottom. So not only the aid, which is normally provided from government to government, the TOAST nowadays include the private sector money as well. So especially under current international regime, so-called sustainable development, which is now everybody knows that word. The financial aid from government is not big enough for one country to have a proper development. And the philanthropists or the NGOs, or especially business and private sector, they tend to bring a lot bigger size of money. So that is now included in the TOAST concept. So now the donor society does not want to work on the taxpayers' money only, but they want to mobilize more finance from the business sector. So these are the, this is brief understanding about the aid terms and how recent aid mechanism wants to include private sector's money. So if you are interested, you can go to the OECD website easily, finding this kind of information. And about the aid also, what I want you to think about is distinguishment between bilateral and multilateral aid. And Jasmine, if I speak too fast, and then you can just interrupt me and tell me, because sometimes I get to, and especially under this circumstance, I was a bit late.
It's fine. It's very fascinating. Thank you.
Right. The bilateral aid is, as it is said, is one from one government to other government, and multilateral aid is kind of a pooled money. So the governments provide money to international organizations like UN, UNDP, WFP, all these organizations, and then they provide their aid to certain recipient countries. So there are two different mechanisms, and also grant and the loan aid. Grant aid is, as it is a grant. So once you provide aid, then that's it. Loan aid is like you lend money to the recipient government. But here the loan aid is very concessional compared to the private or commercial banks. So normally development banks like IMF or World Bank or Asian Development Bank, they provide this loan aid to countries. And when the recipient countries, developing countries receive the money, so-called grace period, which means, from the time you receive the money to repay, that grace period is very long. It's like 50 to 100 years sometimes. Then if you think about the present value of the money, the time you borrow, for example, the 100 pounds today, and the 100 pounds after 50 years, the present value is very different. So it's becoming more and more like a grant. It's very less value. And also the interest rate they need to pay is really, really small percentage compared to the commercial aid. That's why the loan aid is called as a concessional aid. And the reason why I'm telling you about this is for those who are interested in the multilateral bank and the North Korea. So North Korea is not a member of World Bank yet. And normally when we conduct a project like hard infrastructure, the road or big buildings, road work or hospitals, they are mostly funded by loan aid, not grant aid. Grant aid is more like a training or education or very small size projects, but the big size projects are mostly loan aid. And that's why it's important for a recipient country to be a member of World Bank and to receive this loan aid so that they can conduct the big nationwide project. But North Korea is not a member of World Bank. And when the World Bank, for example, receive the membership of the recipient countries, they tend to see the capacity of the state, whether they can repay the loan afterwards or not. So most of the countries nowadays, they are in debt. And North Korea, not only because of its regime style, and not only because of its nuclear program, but also because of its state capacity to repay afterwards is very low. That's why it can't be a member of World Bank at the moment. So these kinds of mechanisms are there. So when you talk about aid, we need to think about aid can't solve everything, it can't. So the grant aid has really its own limit. So that's why we need to think about and consider the loan aid mechanism for North Korea as well. But because the state itself doesn't function as a state, my argument always is that North Korea is a fragile state because the regime is not the state. The state function, the institutions are not there in a way how normal country works, and the regime is very abnormal, as we all know. So that is why we need to understand these eight definitions or mechanisms, then think about why development aid needs to be provided in North Korea, not only humanitarian aid. So that is the very big theme here today for me to start with. So I'm not going to spend any longer about this definition, but this is all different kinds of money flow, the aid flow. So they have different categories and different definitions and different roles in the country when we provide aid. So this is all I captured from OECD website, which you can easily find out afterwards. And they provide very nice, good descriptions about each of those. So I believe that you will be able to find them. So this is it. South Korea, a sister country of North Korea, this is really typical. Once a war-torn, fragile country became world-leading, one of the world-leading economies, industrialized country, and it's like Han River's miracle. Some people say that. So this is exactly the same place in the middle of Seoul, and the left-hand side, the picture is what it looked like before the industrialization, and the right-hand side is today. So this is what it looks like within the half a century time. The South Korea achieved very fast and high level of economic development. As the person who's specialized in development cooperation and development studies, achieving this level of economic development of a country within this period of time is really unique. We don't have many cases in the world. And when we think about North Korea, it's really different story. North Korea, nothing is like South Korea except Kim's family, Kim's regime. Even though North Korea is under sanctions, still we don't see any behavior change of the regime. And they anyhow try to find a way how to evade the sanctions. Nowadays, one of the famous stories about Bitcoin and this cyber currency and how they evade. The technology development in North Korea, the digital economy is another layer of fascinating story about North Korea when you think about. Because of the nuclear program, now North Korea is under sanctions and there's no development aid such as the South Korea received before. So except from 1990s, North Korea haven't received proper aid from other countries yet. South Korean case is one of the textbook-like case. In the early development stage, South Korea received grant aid because it didn't have any capacity to repay, as I said. Then once it reached a certain point of development, then the government built up the capacity to work on finance. Then the international society began to provide the loan aid. Then South Korea could make the industry from soft to the heavy industrialization. That's really a case of the textbook. It's a really good sample of the economic development path. But North Korea is really different. And if we think about then whether we just leave North Korea like that because of a nuclear program, it's just like a dead end. There's no other alternatives for us to provide to North Korea. For example, yes, North Korea is a risk in the security in this region, but at the same time, I think that it's really time to accept that North Korea is a de facto nuclear country. Even though we freeze the Yeonbyung facility, people are still there. Technology is still there. You can't just get rid of all those scientists. They still can carry out their knowledge. So they already have this at a certain point, and anyhow, they still develop the way how to evade the sanctions. And obviously, sanctions do not work in the case of North Korea. And it's more about the people who are being punished, not the regime. As you see this cartoon, this is a typical cartoon to show that Kim Jong-un, you just know, for the sanctions, you know, it's a matter of having a caviar or not. It's not much about his suffering. No, recently he lost his weight. Yes, that could be a story of that. No, he can't reach the proper food, but from my point of view, he can't reach the food like junk food, like cheese or this, you know, the whiskey stuff, which used to make him fat. But nowadays, because of the COVID-19 country isolation, he couldn't reach that, but it's not because of the sanctions. So that is why I keep saying that we need to think about alternatives. Then we need to briefly talk about the SDGs before why I want to tell you that North Korea needs to receive the development aid. So I believe that most of you are very familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals or Millennium Development Goals, which was the before. So because I saw in Australia, even on the public bus before SDG, you used to have the MDG logos so that people could get familiar with. So now we have these 17 goals of SDGs, and these are the good way that countries provide aid to the other countries. Their language is based on the SDG. And the very main theme of SDG is leave no one behind. And clearly, the UN imposed this idea, concept, leave no one behind, but then UN is the one who left North Koreans behind because of the sanctions. It's really paradox, as I see. And yeah, if I think about the people, you know, it's really, and also you all are quite now well known about the defector stories, you know. Even within the North Korean society, those defectors are mostly are privileged ones. In a way, they were mostly donjus, or they have their own financial power. But the people at the bottom of the Songbun, they are still pretty much locked, and then they even don't have access to the information which the middle income level people access. So clearly, not only those people under this Songbun system, but also a majority of population of North Korean citizens are left behind. So this is why I wanted to come up with this SDG concept. But interestingly, what happened? North Korea submitted the so-called Voluntary National Review. So in order to carry out the SDGs by 2030, every single country is recommended, is voluntary, to support the Voluntary National Review to show how the implementation progress is like. For example, the US under Trump, they haven't submitted any VNR yet. Colombia, who was a leading country for this SDG, already submitted 4 reports from 2016 until today. South Korea submitted only once, and North Korea submitted VNR as well. So in 2021. It was supposed to be in 2019, and because of the pandemic, it was postponed again and again. And with the help of UNSCOP, the UN part body of in the Asia Pacific region, the North Korean officials met the UNSCOP officials, and which was led by South Korean personnel. They had the discussion sessions and what it should be like. And interestingly, in this report, this is open to public, you can download it from the website. They mentioned Juche. So Juche is the center point of their SDG implementation. And they used all these buzzwords about this international aid community. And normally when recipient countries provide the VNR, they tend to say what we need in our country. So donors, when you provide aid to our country, remember, these are our priorities. We have our own ownership of the country. So what you think important for us is not important always. So what we say important should be the important priority for you when you provide aid. So that kind of message is embedded in this kind of report. And that's why I was really interested to see this report, then how North Korea carries out its message to the world. And it was not much different from I imagined, at the beginning, I thought it could be not more than the baseline survey, because the statistics capacity is not good in North Korea. And also they can't go beyond of their own Judaism. And the food scarcity is really a big matter than sanitation, all these things. So as you see here, out of 17 goals of SDGs, North Korea's priorities fall under a certain number of goals. And clearly it missed out SDG number 16, which is about accountable institution, and that will limit North Korea developing weaponry and nuclear program. So it's clearly missed out in this report. So this will be another interesting point for you to have a look. But anyhow, by submitting this report, that means North Korea is a part of this international community to carry out the SDG. And most of the recipient countries, for example, the Pacific Islands, they tend to receive more aid from Australian government because it's Pacific, very focused. These are small islands in Pacific. They receive aid from, for example, Australia based on their VNR. And this VNR is lined with their own national development plan, midterm national development plan. And that's how the government now see clearly what is necessary for this country when we provide the development aid. But even though now the government and the international organizations see the situation better in terms of a development sense about North Korea, there's no way to provide aid to North Korea. Number one, currently the COVID-19 border closure. Number two, now Kim regime does not want to receive aid because from its experience in 1990s, the regime now knows that, oh, the aid workers come here, they meet people at the grassroots level, and they communicate with them, and they feed external information to people. So that will be dangerous for our regime. And especially in 1990s, there was this condition that if aid workers speak Korean, they were not allowed to come in to North Korea as aid workers. So these kind of things are already North Korea regime knows. So it's really difficult to provide aid. And also on top of that, when we provide aid, because this is mostly based on the taxpayers' money, we need to be accountable. So that's why monitoring and evaluation is attached all the time to see how this money is used in the country. And North Korean government does not want to have a monitoring, of course, because most of the aid can be used differently from the contract. So this is current situation. Apart from sanctions, sanctions is not, well, sanctions can be lifted, but even though sanctions is lifted, then whether North Korean government itself will cooperate or not, that will be a big question. So this is the situation about North Korea at the moment. So as I said, there was some aid into North Korea, and in 1990s, it was huge aid in terms of the humanitarian. And then still the UNICEF, UNESCO, WFP, mostly about water aid and food aid continued. And the Switzerland has been one of the generous donor for North Korea throughout the years. And even during the pandemic, even though the border was closed, still there's some pledges provided by Swiss government in terms of the water aid and food aid. But the delivery and the logistics were a very different story. Even the water, as you know, in North Korea, all the water pipes are old, and or the clean water couldn't be provided, and it was all controlled by the government. The people can't go even use river water freely because it's also controlled by government. Water has become the power of the government. So because of that, these international organizations try to find a way to reach people to have a basic rights. Water is one of the basic rights, right? Of human rights. And it all start quite rapidly. And not only that, the North Korea used to have the so-called illegal trade with China. Is based on the mirror data from the Chinese government. More than 50% of North Korean trade was with China, and because of the pandemic, it was all stopped. Recently, it gradually started, but still very limited. And amongst all of this story, how then sanctions and the pandemic affected to people? Sanctions didn't effectively work for the regime behavior change in North Korea. It still developed the nuclear weapon, but there is evidence that it really destroyed the life of people, especially when we think about human rights, the women's situation especially. And nowadays, we also have this new term to think about sanctions in a moral sense. It's really immoral because it's people who are suffering from sanctions, not the regime. But with the pandemic, now it looks like a regime also suffers a little bit, mostly because of this trade cut between China and North Korea. So the humanitarian situation in North Korea is not even well known at the moment because all the diplomats who we used to gather the data from are not in North Korea anymore because of the pandemic. No aid workers, are not there anymore. All the UN workers evacuated at early stage of the pandemic started. So we basically literally have no source of data and what is really going on in North Korea at the moment in terms of the humanitarian situation. Because of that, in 2021, already last year, for the first time, the Global Humanitarian Overview report omitted North Korea. Simply, there was nothing to talk about in the report about North Korea. No data, no single statement they could provide because they didn't have any access to data in North Korea. So in this report, and probably in 2022, there's no record about North Korea, which I personally think is really tragic because clearly now all these people are left behind, not physically, but also on the paper. They just don't exist in this paper. And also the vaccine situation, in North Korea was supposed to receive vaccine from the COVAX. And then initially around up to 5% of the whole population was available to have this vaccine from the COVAX. But then the COVAX cut its initial allocation to North Korea because they couldn't reach the clearance system. Once these vaccines arrive in North Korea, they have to go through the government clearance system. It's same to every single government. but North Koreans were really picky on this. So even that small allocation is now became even less. Some say that the North Koreans would have had the vaccines from China and Russia. Possible, very likely, but we don't know the efficacy of those vaccines yet and how much the ordinary people could have the vaccines, right? But good sign is that UNICEF, as you just saw, that now began to provide aid, and then a little amount began to come into North Korea again. So hopefully the situation becomes better. So this is the basic data which you can easily see as a reference. And this is humanitarian aid situation from south to north. So I will be quick because as I see the time's almost there. When we talk about the aid from South Korea to North Korea, I separately presenting this from the international aid because by the constitution of South Korea, North Korea is a part of South Korea's sovereignty. So because of that, we do not categorize the aid from South Korea to North Korea as official development assistance. ODA, official development assistance, is defined as aid from one country to the other country. And because North Korea is a part of South Korea by South Korean constitution, we can't categorize it as ODA. So they, the South Korean government has a different term of the aid to North Korea. So most of the bilateral aid from South Korea to North Korea is not ODA, but the other way is the South Korean government provide aid to international organizations and they provide aid to North Korea, then it becomes multilateral. So that's how we need to see. So for example, this is what I meant, the Inter-Korean Cooperation Fund, managed by Ministry of Unification, but commissioned to Export-Import Bank of Korea. So the Exim Bank in Korea used to provide IKCF. So my ex-colleagues at the bank, they used to be on the ship going to North Korea with rice or the other food, and then landed, and then they were captured in the ship because the North Korean authority did not allow them to come out of the ship, but only the materials, only the goods. So they had to argue at the border, those kind of, all the stories were there, but it stopped at some point. Then that was the basic story of the past. And now under the Moon Jae-in government, there was this big theme about peaceful unification, but let's focus on the human rights issues. And the aid during the Moon Jae-in government was a little bit tricky because of the pandemic period. So it was not possible to compare. But if we think about the different government, if there is a progressive government or a conservative government in South Korea, this the Inter-Korea Economic Fund to North Korea had a turbulence. So as you see, the conservative government really has a tendency to provide less to North. And as we all know, the new president of South Korea looks like, going back to past, yeah, it will be not much different from the time of Park Geun-hye or the previous conservative presidents in South Korea. So I expect that there will be a big, huge decrease of the South aid to North Korea, anyhow, in a way, in this coming period. So these are what Yoon Suk-yeol, the new to-be president, talked about. And he talked quite a lot about North Korea and the North-South relations. If you can read the Korean, I'm sorry, I don't have this in English. But my question here being is that whether he will keep all he promised as it was. So this is another issue. Then anyhow, to wrap up the recap, as I said, this now I want you to have a clearer mind when you read this kind of news clip that food aid, fertilizer aid, is it bilateral or is it multilateral? Is it a grant or is it a loan, or is it from South Korea through the international organizations or South Korea directly to North Korea? What kind of aid would it be, and what would be the impact to the people under this current environment? I think that's from me, and I think I can talk more about this through your questions. Thank you.